Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Joy had grown used to the echo of hardship. Life in the narrow alleyways of Otomiri was a daily grind, but she carried it with a certain quiet pride. She woke up before the sun, fetched water from the rusted community tap, and prepared a small basin of gari and soup before heading to the roadside stall where she sold roasted groundnuts and bread to passers-by. What little she earned, she shared with Modestus, her boyfriend of 4 years. He was tall, sharp-jawed, and filled with potential, though often restless and easily defeated by failure. When he didn't get a job after an interview, Joy comforted him with soft hands and boiled yam. When he wanted to try another business idea, she gave him the little money she had saved for rent. In her eyes, he was a man meant for greater things, and she believed her sacrifices were the fuel he needed to rise. Neighbors whispered about her loyalty, shaking their heads as she patched his trousers, and watched him walk off with a confident strut he hadn't earned. But Joy didn't care. She was planting seeds, and in her heart, she was certain that when Modestus blossomed, he'd take her with him. And so she endured the hunger, the sweat, the slow days of selling just a handful of bread loaves, and the endless cycle of scraping enough to keep the roof over their heads. Her love wasn't loud, it was patient, quiet, steady, built from the threadbare fabric of hope that one day their shared struggles would turn to shared success. Their bond wasn't built on wealth or comfort, but on shared hunger and hope. On nights when the power supply failed, they would sit outside, gazing at the stars while sharing roasted corn from her stall. Modestus would talk about the future, of cars they would drive, trips they would take, and the house he would build with balconies and marble floors. Joy listened with wide eyes, holding on to every word like scripture. She didn't need luxury, she just needed to matter in his dreams. Each morning, she washed his only white shirt, pressing it carefully so he would look sharp for interviews. She massaged his shoulders when he complained of headaches and shared her last sachet of pure water when the heat was unbearable. Even when he snapped at her outfration, she chalked it up to stress and whispered reassurance instead of rebukes. Modestus never said thank you, but Joy kept giving, because love to her was endurance, and she endured. She endured when he forgot her birthday, when he took her savings to invest in a friend's dying venture, when he stayed out late without explanation. She didn't fight for attention, she gave it freely, certain that one day he'd see her sacrifices and reward them with loyalty. Her belief in him ran deeper than logic. It was spiritual, a vow unspoken but fiercely held. When she missed her period and confirmed her pregnancy, her heart raced not with fear, but joy. She imagined Modestus lifting her in excitement, pressing his lips to her forehead, and making promises to be the man she always knew he could become. Instead, when she sat him down one humid evening and told him the news, the look on his face shattered her illusions. He didn't say anything at first. His brows furrowed, his mouth opened then closed. Then came the scoff, a bitter, sharp sound that sliced through the silence. "You want to ruin my life with this nonsense," he barked. "You think I'll marry a roadside girl because you're pregnant?" The words felt like acid on her skin. He stood from the wooden stool, pacing the small room with clenched fists. He accused her of planning it, of trying to trap him. His voice rose until it echoed through the corridor outside. By the end of it, he told her to leave, that he had no intention of being tied down by a mistake, that she should go back to wherever she came from and take the pregnancy with her. Joy didn't argue. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. She stood, wiped her tears, and walked out. That night, she lay awake on a borrowed mat at her neighbor's place, her hand on her belly, her chest hollow. But even then, her thoughts weren't of hate, they were of survival. For herself, and for the child that already had her heart. The next morning, barefoot and heavy with child, Joy tied her clothes in a faded Ankara wrapper and placed it on her head. The entire compound watched from behind open doors and curtained windows. Some whispered, others simply stared. Modestus leaned against the doorway of his one-room apartment, arms folded, watching her like a stranger. He said nothing, she said nothing. The silence was thick with humiliation. Her chin was raised but her eyes glistened. With each step, her back arched slightly under the weight of the baby and her belongings. Dust clung to her feet as she made her way to nowhere in particular. Her dignity was all she had left and she carried it like a crown. As she disappeared down the narrow road, a few children followed her briefly before being called back by their mothers. Joy didn't look back. She had nothing left to return to. Her tears fell silently as she walked, but each step was a statement, a declaration that she would not break. That no matter how much she had lost, she would still fight for herself and the life growing inside her. The compound closed behind her like a book she never wanted to reread. The chapter of Modestus was over. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with grace and fire. Joy didn't know where her feet were taking her that morning. The dust on the roads clung to her ankles like judgment, and the heat of the rising sun pressed down on her shoulders like punishment. But she walked. With each step, her fingers tightened around the plastic bag that held the only 2 wrappers she owned and a few underclothes. The faded Ankara tied atop her head bobbed slightly with her movement, the weight more emotional than physical. Her pregnancy was beginning to show more than she could hide, and every passerby seemed to glance at her belly before looking away. She walked past the same market she once sold groundnuts in, the women now staring at her with either pity or curiosity. There were no words, no greetings, just silence. She reached a small uncompleted building at the edge of town, where the walls were bare cement and the windows held no glass. A widow had once told her she could rest there if she ever needed it. Joy slipped inside, sat down on the cold floor, and finally let herself cry. Not the quiet tears of the night before, but deep, chest-cracking sobs that echoed against the walls. No one came to check, no one asked why she was there. And when her tears dried, she leaned her back against the wall, closed her eyes, and whispered to her unborn child, "I will not fail you." The days that followed were unforgiving. Joy began working at a small laundry shop where she hand-washed clothes from dawn till dusk for barely enough to eat. The work wrecked her body, aching shoulders, cracked palms, and swollen ankles from standing too long, but it paid a little, and she needed every naira. Her pregnancy progressed, and so did the stares. People began to recognize her as the girl Modestus sent away. Sometimes they'd whisper when she walked by, but no one offered help. She stayed in the widow's incomplete building, using mosquito nets and pieces of cloth to keep the rain and bugs out. Every night she curled into herself, feeling her baby kick, whispering promises through the dark. There was no softness in her world anymore, only grit. But even in her exhaustion, Joy held on to one truth. She wouldn't let her child suffer for Modestus's cowardice. When the widow returned from her trip and found Joy still living in the shell of her home, she took her in properly. She gave her a mat, a pillow, and the dignity of being spoken to with kindness. The older woman's name was Mama Izioma, and her presence became the first warm thing in Joy's life in months. She didn't ask questions, she just helped. In time, Joy gave birth to a boy. She named him Jackson, a name that meant strength and healing in the language she once heard from a storybook. The labor had been long, painful, and solitary, but Mama Izioma stayed with her throughout, placing wet cloths on her forehead and holding her hand as Joy screamed into the night. When the child was placed in her arms, something inside her shifted. All the pain melted in purpose. Jackson's eyes were wide, searching, and when their skin touched, Joy knew she'd been reborn too. She didn't have much, but she had him. Her world changed shape overnight. From then on, every decision she made was through the lens of motherhood. She strapped him to her back and went back to work at the laundry shop after just 2 weeks. When that wasn't enough, she added janitorial work at a local clinic. She bathed in cold water, wore second-hand clothes, and ate leftovers just to make sure Jackson had powdered milk and diapers. Despite the constant hunger and fatigue, she never complained. Her eyes began to reflect something different, something firmer, more dangerous. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. Years passed slowly. Jackson grew into a curious and quiet child. He didn't talk much, but he watched everything. He noticed the way his mother never sat until everything was done. He noticed how she gave the best portion of food to him and wore the same worn slippers until they split. At age 6, he started helping out, folding clothes, carrying buckets, running small errands for Mama Izioma. The neighborhood boys mocked him for it, but he didn't care. He had inherited his mother's dignity, even if he didn't understand it yet. At night, Joy studied online using borrowed data and second-hand devices. Mama Izioma helped with Jackson while she read ebooks and wrote papers late into the night. Slowly, painfully, she earned certifications. One day, a local tech startup needed someone who could manage back-end logistics. Joy applied. With a well-written CV and a quiet confidence, she walked into the interview room and shocked them. She was hired. The pay wasn't much at first, but it was a door. A year later, she moved out of the uncompleted building into a tiny apartment of her own. Jackson had his own mattress. Mama Izioma had her own room. Joy had a desk, a bookshelf, and the beginning of a new life. By the time Joy had settled into the rhythm of life in her small apartment in Arundel, the world had already started to shift beneath her feet in ways she didn't yet understand. Jackson, now nearly 11, had become her shadow, a boy with thoughtful eyes and a silence that spoke volumes. He excelled in school, often surprising his teachers with how attentive and observant he was. But more than his brilliance, it was his empathy that set him apart. He could sense his mother's weariness before she even sat down. Some evenings he would heat water without being asked, drawing her a warm bath after her long days at the consultancy firm. The job had evolved from back-end logistics to overseeing operations, and Joy, now in her early 30s, carried herself with quiet authority. She didn't speak much in meetings, but when she did, people listened. There was something about her presence, formed from years of pain and perseverance, that demanded respect without needing to raise a voice. Still at home, she was simply Jackson's mother. She made his favorite jollof rice every Friday, ironed his uniforms, and read through his homework with a level of dedication that exhausted her, but fulfilled her too deeply for words. Their little home was modest, but it was filled with laughter, books, music, and the kind of peace that money couldn't manufacture. Even Mama Izioma, now much older and slower in her movements, found herself smiling more. Her laughter became the soft percussion in the background of their new beginning. Modestus's name was never spoken within those walls, but the echoes of what he did lingered like old dust in the corners. Joy had buried him in her past, not with hatred, but with something colder indifference. It wasn't until one evening, while scrolling through her phone, that she stumbled upon a photo on a news blog. Modestus standing beside Bianca at a charity ball hosted in Port Aurea. He was dressed in a fitted tuxedo, Bianca draped in a silver gown that sparkled under chandeliers. The article praised their generosity, their social influence, their business acumen. Joy stared at the screen for a long time, not out of longing, not even out of hurt, but with the same curiosity one might feel upon seeing an old forgotten scar. Her son, meanwhile, had noticed her silence but said nothing. She simply locked the screen and set the phone aside, her expression unreadable. Across town in the heart of Port Aurea's elite district, Modestus's reality was unraveling behind the glittering facade. The empire he built with Bianca was solid, but their marriage was not. Every clinic they visited offered the same conclusion: unexplained infertility. At first, it was whispered tension. Then it became loud arguments. Modestus's once confident smile thinned, replaced with a brooding quietness that unsettled his staff. Bianca cried in private, then began to disappear for hours without explanation. The house that one echoed with dreams was now filled with slammed doors and cold dinners. Modestus had everything he thought he wanted, but it felt like drinking salt water. The more he had, the thirstier he became. He began to revisit memories, not out of guilt but desperation. He remembered Joy's quiet strength, the way she always made sure he ate even when she hadn't, the way she held his hands during his panic attacks, even when he didn't thank her. He wondered, not for the first time, if he had made a mistake. But pride kept the thought from blooming fully. He told himself that Joy would still be poor, still struggling, probably somewhere in Otamiri selling groundnuts again. That thought comforted him briefly, until the day he attended the Arundel Innovation Summit. It was Bianca's idea, a last-ditch attempt to stay relevant. She dressed in red, smiled for the cameras, and held his hand like everything was perfect. They sat in the front row, nodding along to pitches they barely understood. Then came a presentation from a teenage boy with soft eyes and a confident voice. His name was John Obielu. His project was focused on smart city logistics, and it was brilliant. The moment he walked off stage, Modestus leaned forward, staring at the boy. His face, his posture, even the way he rubbed the back of his neck, it was like looking into a mirror of the past. Something in his gut twisted. He found him backstage, introduced himself casually. "Impressive work," he said. Jackson smiled politely. "Thank you, sir." Modestus's voice caught slightly as he asked, "What's your full name again?" Jackson responded without hesitation, "Jackson Obielu. My mother is Joy Obielu." That moment stretched like glass about to shatter. Modestus's mouth went dry. His heartbeat roared in his ears. The crowd around them moved, laughed, congratulated winners, but he heard nothing. He stood frozen, watching the boy disappear into the crowd. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. Bianca noticed his restlessness but said nothing. Modestus rose before dawn, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor for hours. He hadn't cried in years, but his eyes burned. He searched Joy's name online, found photos, a bio, a LinkedIn profile that listed her as head of operations at a thriving tech firm in Arundel. Her smile in the photo was soft, mature, untouchable. He hadn't just abandoned her. He'd buried himself from the life he could have had, and now it was too late to dig his way back. Modestus stood at the entrance of Joy's house in Arundel, his body soaked from the sudden downpour, his hands trembling slightly though he tried to hide it behind clasped fingers. The gate was grand, not ostentatious but elegant. Black iron with floral designs welded into its frame, flanked by manicured hedges and warm exterior lights that glowed gently despite the rain. He hadn't needed a map to find the place. Her name had appeared on a professional listing, and once he knew where to look, he simply followed the trail. Still, nothing had prepared him for the house itself, for the evidence of what she had become. The path to the front door was tiled, bordered by soft green grass and potted plants, and the walls of the house had been painted a creamy ivory that made everything look warm and alive. Modestus's heart beat heavily as he stood there, hesitant, unsure whether to ring the bell or turn back and run. But something deeper than shame rooted him to the spot. The door opened before he could knock again. Jackson stood there, taller now, shoulders broader, still holding that quiet calm in his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't ask why my Modestus was there. He simply stepped aside and let him in without a word, as if he had been expecting it. As Modestus walked through the door, the soft scent of sandalwood and fresh flowers greeted him, and every corner of the house reflected love, discipline, and quiet success. The floor was tiled in polished gray, the furniture plush and modern but not excessive. Paintings of abstract African art lined the walls, and in the far corner, a small piano stood beside a shelf of books. Joy descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the high-ceilinged living room like a countdown. She was dressed in a deep blue dress that hugged her figure without screaming for attention, her natural hair coiled into a soft bun at the nape of her neck. She didn't wear makeup, but she didn't need to. Her presence alone was commanding. Modestus's breath caught as he looked at her. She had aged, yes, but beautifully, with grace and purpose. The girl he discarded had been replaced by a woman he didn't know how to face. He lowered his eyes as she approached, suddenly unsure of what to say. Joy didn't stop until she stood just a few feet away. Her expression was unreadable, her arms crossed loosely under her chest. Silence stretched between them for a moment before she spoke, her voice calm, measured, and so painfully different from the girl who once cried on his doorstep. "Why are you here, Modestus?" Her tone wasn't angry, but it held no softness either. He fumbled, clearing his throat, words tangled in regret and uncertainty. "I saw Jackson at the summit. He looks just like me." Joy raised a brow slightly. "That's usually how biology works." Her sarcasm wasn't cruel, it was honest. Real. Modestus nodded, eyes still fixed on the floor. "I didn't know about him, about you, about any of this." Joy remained quiet, then slowly moved to sit on the edge of the sofa. She motioned for him to do the same, and he sat on the opposite couch, his posture stiff. The air between them was thick, not with hostility, but with history. She studied him as one might study a fading painting, something once familiar now distant and oddly surreal. Modestus glanced around the house again, then at her. "You did all this on your own?" She tilted her head slightly, her lips lifting in a dry smile. "With the help of God, and the hands you pushed away." He flinched at her words, not because she was cruel, but because she was right. He looked older than he remembered, tired, less arrogant, more hollow. "I was stupid," he admitted, "young and afraid. I thought I was chasing success, but I lost myself on the way." Joy leaned back slightly, one leg crossed over the other. "You didn't lose yourself, Modestus. You threw parts of yourself away every time you chose pride over people, wealth over worth, noise over peace." The words were delivered like a surgeon's blade, precise, necessary, and clean. He nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I came to ask if there's any way I could be part of his life, even just a little." The request hung in the air like smoke. Joy's face didn't shift. She turned to glance toward the hallway where Jackson had disappeared. Then she looked back at Modestus. "He's old enough to choose for himself, but I won't force him into anything. You may have fathered him, Modestus, but he became a man without your help." Modestus's eyes watered. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold himself together. "I've made so many mistakes," he whispered, "and you're not the only one who paid for them." Joy stood, smoothing her dress down gently. "I'm not here to punish you," she said softly. "Life already did that. But understand this, you don't get to waltz back in and rewrite the story. This house, this peace, this child, it was all built in your absence. And it thrives because of your absence." She didn't say it with venom. She said it like one might read a fact from a newspaper. Then she offered a small nod, as if to signal the end of their conversation. Modestus rose too slower now, his hands slightly shaking. He wanted to ask more, to stay longer, but he didn't. He had come seeking a door, but all he found was a mirror. As Jackson re-entered the living room, Joy stepped aside so the two could speak. Modestus looked at his son, this boy whose life he had missed, whose first words he hadn't heard, whose milestones were memories he would never have. Jackson stood tall, not with hostility, but with the calm that Joy had passed down to him like an inheritance. They spoke briefly, an exchange of polite words, of cautious glances. Jackson didn't hug him, didn't scowl either. He simply said, "I'll think about it," when Modestus asked to see him again. And that was that. Modestus walked back toward the door, Joy watching from a distance. As he stepped outside, the rain had stopped, the street was quiet. The lights of her home glowed behind him, warm and unreachable. He stood for a moment on the pavement, inhaled the night air, and turned to look back one last time. Joy had already closed the door. Not slammed, not locked, just gently, finally. He walked away with no umbrella, no chauffeur, no pride. Just silence. And for the first time in years, it felt like a kind of honesty he didn't know he had left in him. The days after Modestus's visit passed like quiet ripples over a calm lake. Joy didn't speak of it, and neither did Jackson. There was no need. The air in the house had changed slightly, more reflective, like something long buried had surfaced and settled once again. Joy carried on with her work at the consultancy firm, but her thoughts wandered more than usual. Sometimes she would pause mid-sentence during a meeting or stare too long at her laptop screen, her mind replaying moments not from the recent encounter, but from the years between then and now. She remembered the days when she had no voice, when she had to beg landlords for mercy and count coins to buy baby food. She remembered Jackson's first steps on a cracked concrete floor, and his first laugh echoing through a one-room space. Now they lived in a quiet estate with a functioning gate, a car that started every time, and neighbors who waved without pity. There was no glory in the struggle, but there was dignity in survival. And that survival had given birth to a life she never imagined. Yet even with the victories, the echoes of her past sometimes rang louder than the present. She wasn't broken anymore, but she was still healing. And healing, she had learned, was not about forgetting. It was about living in spite of the memory. Jackson had always been mature for his age, but after that night, something in his eyes seemed to shift. He asked more questions, not about Modestus, but about life, about choices, about legacy. One evening, as they sat on the back porch sharing fried yam and pepper sauce, he turned to her and asked, "Do you think people can truly change?" Joy, caught off guard by the suddenness of the question, looked at him carefully before responding. "I think people can choose to be better," she said slowly. "But change isn't something you say. It's something you live day by day, moment by moment." He nodded, taking in her words like scripture. It wasn't long before his tone returned to normal, lightening with a joke about how spicy the sauce was, but the weight of his question lingered. He was thinking, processing, not just about his father, but about the kind of man he wanted to be. Joy watched him, wondering how someone born from so much pain could carry himself with such peace. She had raised him with love, but also with honesty. She never painted Modestus as a monster, just a man who made choices. And now Jackson had the right to make his own. She knew that whatever decision he made, whether to let his father in or keep him out, it would be his and his alone. That kind of power was something she had never been given. She would not take it from him. Across town, Modestus found himself moving through his days like a ghost. He attended meetings, signed documents, and gave interviews, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The image of Jackson, tall, articulate, grounded, haunted him. He had imagined a child who would be angry, defiant, maybe even rebellious. But Jackson was composed, strong, too strong for someone raised without a father. And that realization wounded Modestus in a place pride couldn't shield. He began to avoid Bianca at home, retreating into the study and spending more time alone. Their conversations had long since turned hollow, filled with routine updates and passive remarks. One night, after yet another silent dinner, she asked without looking up from her glass of wine, "So, what do you plan to do about the boy?" Modestus didn't answer right away. He stared at the shadows dancing on the wall. "I don't know," he admitted. Bianca's sigh was sharp and tired. "Well, figure it out. Because whatever this limbo is, it's eating you up." He knew she was right. He had spent so long pretending the past was irrelevant. And now that it stood in front of him, fully grown and breathing, he had no idea how to confront it. Part of him wanted to walk away again, to retreat into the familiar comfort of denial. But another part, a quieter, more desperate part, wanted to earn something real. Days turned into weeks. Modestus sent Joy a message asking if Jackson would be willing to meet again, just the two of them. It was short, polite, respectful. Joy showed it to Jackson and let him decide. After a moment's thought, he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe near the edge of town, far from the noise of Modestus's world. Jackson arrived first, dressed in a simple white shirt and jeans. He looked calm, unbothered, but Modestus could tell he had his guard up. Modestus wore no suit, just a polo shirt and loafers, an attempt to meet the moment with humility. Their conversation began awkwardly, filled with safe questions about school and hobbies. But slowly the walls thinned. Modestus spoke of his own childhood, his dreams, and even his failures. He didn't defend his choices, he didn't offer excuses, he just told the truth. And Jackson, listening carefully, asked the kinds of questions only a son would ask. By the time they finished their drinks, there was no reunion, no declarations, but there was an understanding. A fragile bridge had been built. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. And as Modestus watched Jackson walk away from the cafe, tall and sure of himself, he realized that love, if it would come, would take time. But for the first time in years, he was willing to wait. Months passed like pages turning gently in the wind. Jackson continued to meet Modestus from time to time, but nothing was forced. No titles were reclaimed, no dramatic moments of reconciliation occurred. They simply talked, sometimes about work, sometimes about family, sometimes about regrets. Modestus learned quickly that he couldn't rewrite the years he missed. He couldn't speak of Jackson's childhood or recall stories of his first school play. He wasn't there for scraped knees or birthdays or late-night fevers. And while that realization hurt, it also grounded him. For the first time in his life, he stopped performing and simply showed up as he was. A flawed man hoping to be a better one. Jackson, for his part, offered grace without promises. He never called him dad, but he didn't push him away either. Their relationship settled into a quiet understanding, shaped not by obligation, but by mutual respect. Meanwhile, Joy watched from a distance, not out of bitterness, but from a place of peace. She didn't interfere, didn't eavesdrop, didn't expect a thing from Modestus. Her job had been to raise Jackson well, and she had. Now whatever came after was between father and son. Bianca, on the other hand, felt her world collapsing in slow motion. The wedge between her and Modestus had become a canyon, wide and unbridgeable. At first she tried to salvage what was left, planned vacations, scheduled date nights, even suggested therapy. But Modestus had checked out emotionally and mentally. His silence grew louder than his presence. One afternoon, after a particularly tense conversation about legacy and children, Bianca finally exploded. "Do you even love me anymore?" she shouted, tears threatening to spill. Modestus looked at her with weary eyes, the kind that had seen too much and said too little for too long. "I don't know," he replied honestly. That answer, soft and unembellished, broke something in Bianca that day. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She simply packed a bag and left the house that evening. Modestus didn't stop her. He watched her drive away and stood in the driveway long after her taillights disappeared. For the first time he was truly alone. And yet it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like silence finally having its say. In the days that followed, he wandered the house like a ghost. The luxury felt cold, the rooms echoed. And at night he lay awake not regretting the loss of marriage, but marveling at the clarity solitude could bring. Joy received the news of Bianca's departure through a mutual acquaintance, but she didn't react. She neither smiled nor frowned. It wasn't her business. Her life was full: promotions, projects, volunteer initiatives, and of course Jackson's preparation for university. He had been offered a scholarship to a top institution overseas, and while she was proud, a piece of her heart ached at the thought of watching him go. They spent his final months at home revisiting old memories, photo albums, home videos, faded baby clothes. On his last weekend before traveling, they visited Mama Izioma's grave. The old widow had passed a year prior, and Joy had built a small but dignified headstone with an inscription that read, "She gave us shelter and taught us to build." Jackson knelt and placed white lilies on the grave while Joy stood behind him, her eyes misty. She hadn't cried at the funeral, but now, with her son at the edge of adulthood and the past fully behind them, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the journey. She had lost much, but she had built more. And even though she never received an apology grand enough to match her pain, she had created a life that needed no validation. That was her closure. The day Jackson left for university, the house felt too quiet. Joy walked into his room, now neatly folded and bare, and sat on the edge of his bed. Her fingers grazed the sheets as if touching memories. The walls held the echoes of laughter, arguments, growing pains, and whispered prayers. She stayed there for a long while, letting the silence settle in. Later that evening, she received a message from Modestus. It wasn't long, just a thank you for raising Jackson, for not poisoning him against his father, for everything. Joy read the message, smiled faintly, and put down the phone. She didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and the rustle of leaves. Life had come full circle, not with fireworks, but with a soft closing of a chapter. Joy stood, smoothed her dress, and walked downstairs. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen, and she made herself a cup of tea. No music played, no television buzzed, just the hum of a home built with patience, resilience, and quiet victories. She took a sip, sighed, and sat by the window. Outside, the world moved on, and so did she. In life, we often underestimate the quiet strength of those who love us without condition, and this story is a powerful reminder of what it means to cherish loyalty, sacrifice, and patience. Joy didn't love Modestus because he had money, fame, or status. She loved him when he had nothing, when the world had turned its back on him. She shared her last meal with him, wiped his tears, and stood beside him through rejection and hardship. But the tragedy in this story lies in how easily Modestus discarded that love when it no longer suited the image he wanted to present to the world. His greatest mistake wasn't just abandoning Joy, it was doing so at the very moment her love proved its deepest. There's a profound lesson in watching Joy walk away, pregnant and heartbroken without cursing or begging. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was dignity. In a world that often expects women to scream to be heard, she spoke louder through her grace and resilience. She didn't chase revenge. She didn't scheme to make Modestus regret his decision. She focused on building herself, brick by brick, in quiet corners no one thought to look. And years later, when the very man who called her pregnancy a burden came knocking, she didn't slam the door. She simply let him see what he missed. Not out of pride, but from a place of clarity that comes when you've healed on your own. Modestus's journey also teaches something essential. You can achieve everything the world applauds and still be hollow inside if you build it by stepping on those who stood with you at your lowest. He had the cars, the company, the social status. But in the end, none of those things filled the void of losing a love that was real. By the time he realized what he'd thrown away, joy had evolved into someone far beyond his reach. That's what happens when you mistake patience for passivity. Some people don't stay broken. They rebuild stronger, and when they are whole again, they no longer fit into the spaces you left them in. For the audience, this story is a mirror. It makes us question how we treat those who love us when we have nothing. Do we uplift them when we rise, or do we trade them in for shinier, more convenient companions? It also speaks to the power of motherhood and the sacredness of raising a child with love, even when the other parent walks away. Joy's love raised a boy into a man, one who grew with a sense of self rooted in truth, not bitterness. Above all is a message of hope, that you can be abandoned, humiliated, and overlooked and still rise. That your worth is not determined by who leaves you, but by how you choose to live after they do. Joy never needed revenge. Her peace, her success, her son, those were enough. And that is the quiet, beautiful justice life sometimes gives to those who endure. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.